Okay, so good morning, everyone, and wonderful to see everyone. We do start a new series today, and this year is sponsored in honor of Meir Ben Shimon, or Meir Ben Shimon, who's the outsider today. Meir Ben Shimon happens to be not happens to be was my grandfather, my oppa, and it's ironic that actually we'll be dealing today with a seminal German Jewish thinker. My grandfather came from Germany, from a small town near Frankfurt and married my grandmother, who came from the aristocracy of Hirschian Frankfurt. And a large part of, I suppose, their Jewish upbringing and their own life and decisions within the development of their own family in the Jewish world was caught up in the German Jewish response to some of the developments that Moshe Mendelssohn initiated. And Moshe Mendelssohn and our scholar, Moses Mendelssohn and our scholar, are the subject of the next mini-series. And I should say a number of points. The first is it's almost there is almost no more controversial figure in we'll call modern Jewish times that I could speak about. His legacy remains controversial, enormously controversial, astronomically so, and almost anything anyone has to say on him will arouse controversy. So anything I have to say will in some level or other upset some people because his legacy is claimed by so many. As a result, I will say nothing. I will simply share the facts with you and let you all form your own conclusions. So anyone who's upset with anything I say, please don't blame me. I'm just saying the facts and not true. Now, on a more serious note, I will endeavour to present simply the facts as they are, and there are many different ways of reading his life and his work and his achievements and his responsibility. Um, it is, and all these facts are true, and that's the challenge over here. It is an undoubted fact that he was a fully practicing halachic Orthodox Jew, in the sense that we have no reason to doubt and a lot of reason to believe that he was a medakdek in mitzvahs and shomer Torah in mitzvahs fully. It is also a fact that on a biological level, only two of his six children remained Jewish, and in the next generations, none of his descendants. He has no Jewish progeny. His family ended up in total assimilation, and whilst no one can be blamed for the decisions their children makes, that was certainly a controversial point of his legacy because it fed into the narrative that his net contribution to Jewish identity was assimilationist and damaging. So we have a figure who was orthodox in the fullest extent, somewhat of a Talmud Chacham, and we'll speak about that, who wrote some significant works, who remained a proud Jew to his dying day, who saw himself as doing nothing other than fighting assimilation in his life's work, who believed he was strengthening Jewish identity, and probably would have been shocked and horrified at some of the results of I was going to say reforms, but that's too loaded a word, but some of the changes he initiated. And of course, amongst those changes he initiated, his claims as the father of Haskala, the Jewish Enlightenment, which arguably took place across Western Europe and then spread, to Eastern Europe, and ultimately as the father of reform, thus is claimed his legacy. He was someone who was harshly criticized by some of the most famous names of the Jewish leadership at the time, the most famous poskim and gedolim of the time, and yet also supported and quoted by others. And he was really on the cusp of Jewish modernity, born into a world in which Jews faced enormous discrimination and limitations. It died in a world in which Jews still faced enormous limitations and persecution, but in a world that was somewhat more open than the world into which he was born. He was an important figure in opening up that world, both by dint of his sheer brilliance and personality, and in a world that argued that Jews couldn't be noble, couldn't be educated, couldn't be intellectual, couldn't be intelligent. He was so shockingly and clearly all of those. And thus, by dint just of the remarkable human being that he was, he opened up German society to Jewish integration in a very significant way, and also by arguing for it. He was a brilliant writer, as we all see, and engaged in correspondence with leading thinkers and royalty at the time, and had enormous impact on the development, therefore, of German acceptance of its Jewish population, and its belief that they could be integrated into larger German culture. So he's an astoundingly controversial character, whose legacy can really shift from one end of the spectrum to the other. And arguably, some of his views still strike a chord to a modern Orthodox Jew. I don't mean modern Orthodox with a capital M, capital O. I'm saying an Orthodox Jew engaging with modernity. So he's a very difficult figure to speak about, and one that almost anything one says is difficult and troubling, and it's very hard to get into his inner life and really work out what made him tick. What did he believe in? He was definitely good. A believer in God. He was definitely a believer in halacha and kept halacha. But what was really driving him? Which half of the two? If you're a Jewish leader integrating Judaism into German culture, are you doing that for the survival of Judaism, or because consciously or subconsciously you wish to sanitize and westernize Judaism? And this remains a very difficult matter and very controversial, very difficult to ascertain what was really at the heart of what motivated him. Was he ultimately successful? Also very difficult to say. Was he an important figure in allowing the ghetto gates to fall and allowing German Jewry to integrate with broader German society? He was. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? Very hard to answer. Surely it's a good thing that people can earn a livelihood, can have access to education, and can break out of the confines of the ghetto. But the impact on Jewish identity ultimately led to a great wave of assimilation. Would that wave have anyway happened without him? Quite possibly, quite probably. Very hard famously to work out alternative histories when you're a historian. What would have happened had an important figure not been there? What would have been the trajectory of Jewish and German development? Did German-Jewish integration end so well? I think we can all answer that question. On the other hand, that's a little unfair also, because did Jewish integration into Western society end well? Well, we're still living through the Great Experiment, and who knows? So these are all very, very difficult questions to answer. This series is part of the Great Jewish Thinkers series, and as I said right at the beginning of the series, I'm not claiming that everyone in this series is a great Jewish thinker. We dealt with in a sense, non-Jewish thinkers. We dealt with Aristotle and Plato, but their impact on Jewish thought, the constructed Aristotle-Plato Jewish character that had such a significant impact on Sadigon and even more significant on Rambam, was Ramosha Mendelssohn, a great Jewish thinker. Depends who you ask. Was he a great thinker? Yes. Was he Jewish? Yes. And thus, did he have an impact on the Jewish world? He didn't just happen to be Jewish. He had an enormous impact on the Jewish world. Yes, absolutely. And therefore, I think he's entitled to a place on our series and important for us to understand and think about. Okay, so what I would like to do today is really just run through the headlines of his life. I'm not sure how long this series will be. We'll see what depth we go into. I've stopped trying to predict the length of my series given my recent failure in other series that went on far longer. What I'd like to try and do though is run through the facts of his life, the story of his life, his biography, which is very interesting. A couple of the main influences on his life, and really a summary of the controversies. And I would love it if by the end of today, if we succeed, we can sort of emerge with some understanding of why his legacy is so complicated and why it's so difficult to make sense of what he was trying to achieve. And he was such a nuanced figure. I suppose any nuanced figure to some degree or other, it doesn't end up fitting into boxes in the way that we would like, and that's part of the difficulty with him. He also, perhaps foolishly, stepped into domains that weren't his own. We'll see later. He was definitely somewhat of a learned person. I don't know if he was a Tam Chacham or not, but he definitely had a significant degree of learning. I don't think anyone claimed he was a posek, and yet foolishly he stepped into the world of Pesach and was slammed for that. So definitely we can look back on his career and say he made mistakes, but it's easy to criticize. Equally, he was definitely a great man. By saying he was a great person, I don't mean approval or disapproval. I simply mean he was an astonishing and astounding individual, a genius of immeasurable portion. Had he lived in another time and place, he would have been a classic Eloi and gone on to become, a classic Jewish leader, gone in Torah. He was that sort of person. He was an intellectual who spent his life in thought. That was what excited him, and was staggeringly brilliant in so doing. And none of that is controversial. These are facts. Okay, so he's Moses Mendelssohn, Moshe Mendelssohn. He's born in September 1729 and dies in January 1786, So he died at, anyone can do the maths, about 56, I think. Interestingly, he's a near contemporary, just to locate him in time, with the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon lives, of course, in Vilna in East Europe and is born in 1720 and dies in 1797. So rough alignment. Vilna Gaon born a few years before him, dies a couple of years after him, but rough alignment of sort of era. And they are aware of each other, by the way. We'll talk later about that, but they are aware of each other. He is born in Dessau, which is a backwater sort of Jewish area in Germany. In Jewish literature, he's often referred to as Ramosha Dessau, Ramad Reish Mem Daled, Ramad Ramosha Dessau, and that's often how he is quoted. His name Mendelssohn is a name he adopted in an era when surnames are becoming more popular. He's Ben Mendelssohn. He's quite literally the son of Mendel. His father is Mendel, so he's Moshe Ben Mendel, and he takes on the more Germanic sounding Moses Mendelssohn. He's born into a learned, somewhat learned, poor Jewish family. His father is a sofer. His family are poor. Moses Mendelssohn suffers from poor health his whole life and dies in his mid-50s, which is early even for the time. He suffers from a curvature of the spine. It's not clear if that's because of poor nutrition when he's young or some form of genetic illness. His cause of his death isn't clear. He suffered poor health and he's described as dying of a cold, possibly pneumonia, but there's theories about other reasons for other health challenges that he suffered. So he lives a life of considerable poor health. He lives a life of controversy, and he has to waste an enormous amount of energy on controversy. Some close to him claim he died of stress from the controversies. But he's born in this poor Jewish family. I can't remember if I mentioned his father is a sofer, and that's not a great livelihood. And he studies under the Rav of Dessau, who's a figure known as Reb David Frankel. Now, Reb David Frankel, or Reb David Hirsch Frankel, his Hebrew name is Reb David ben Naphtali. Naphtali is the deer becomes Hirsch. So in German Jewish practice, like Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is really Shimshon, son of Raphael. So he's Reb David Hirsch Frankel, David, son of Hirsch Frankel. His Rebbe in Dessau, and he follows his Rebbe at age 14, when his Rebbe is promoted to become the Rav of Berlin. He follows him at age 14 to go and learn in his yeshiva in Berlin. His Rebbe, David Frankel, is a gadol of the first tier. So we're talking about Moses Mendelssohn learnt under a Talmud Chacham of top level repute. There's no doubt about that, and learnt in a high level yeshiva in Berlin for some time. What is Reb David Frankel famous for? As I said, he himself, Reb David Frankel, was born in Berlin, became the Rav of Dessau, and later became, when Moses Mendelssohn was 14, in 1742, became the Rav of Berlin. And he was Reb David Frankel was a classic Talmud Chacham. He wrote the seminal Perush on the Talmud Yerushalmi. Now is not the time to go into the full history of the development of Gemara, but basically, as we know, two versions of Gemara were written. The more popular Talmud Bavli, which is the one that we learn and from which halacha derives. The in Eretz Yisrael, truncated due to persecution, was another yeshivas and Bati Medrash that coalesced around learning the Mishnah, and whose conversations were recorded in the Eretz Yisrael version of the Talmud, not written in Yerushalayim, but in the Galil, known as the Talmud Yerushalmi. And it was very unlearned through the generations, relatively unlearned. In addition, it's written in a slightly different Aramaic to Judeo-Aramaic used in Bovel. In addition, it didn't go through a proper editing process because of persecution in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore it's really an enigmatic, much more closed text, other than to the greatest scholars. And he wrote a remarkable work known as Carbon Ha'eda and Shiari Ha'eda, Shiari Carbon, on one side. And to this day, the Talmud Yerushalmi is printed with his work. He wrote a Rashi-type commentary on the Talmud Yerushalmi, a flowing commentary. This is Reb David Frankel, the Rebbe of Moses Mendelssohn, and he wrote a Tosfos type commentary on the Yerushalmi. So he really opened up the Talmud Yerushalmi as a piece of work. And as I said, he moved when Mendelssohn was 14 to Berlin, and Mendelssohn followed his Rebbe to Berlin and learnt in his yeshiva, which by any account was a top-notch yeshiva. So it's true that Moses Mendelssohn didn't learn in classic yeshiva learning more than a few years, but he was definitely for a time in his life, a good yeshiva bacha, and therefore had access to high-level Torah texts and Talmudic texts and halachic texts, and the ability to learn through them. Sorry, Jonathan, did you want to ask something or no? Okay, so that's his Jewish education. Interestingly, David Frankel also introduced him to a work that doesn't feature on the classic Jewish study yeshiva curricula, which is the philosophical works of the Rambam, the Moreh Nevuchim, and where Moses Mendelssohn learnt these classic. We learned the Rambam's Guide to the Perplexed, his Moreh Nevuchim, and this really drew him in to philosophical research and philosophical interest. When we discussed the Moreh Nevuchim, we discussed how it is in some ways a dangerous work, and in many ways the frum world has retreated from learning it because it can raise serious questions. It can lead one away from what had become at least traditional Jewish thought. And Moses Mendelssohn is certainly one of the important figures that made people even more cautious about the Guide to the Perplexed and Moreh Nevuchim. And if we ask ourselves why we live in a world in which Moreh Nevuchim really is not learned, there's many reasons for that, including the what many would argue the devastating impact it had on the trajectory of Moses Mendelssohn's career, in which he went from being a promising rabbinic student to someone completely different. So this is the sort of outline of his early years. At age 14, he arrives in Berlin, in a profoundly anti-Semitic world still, a world of extreme discrimination against Jews. For example, in the family biography, it's recorded that he could only enter Berlin through one particular gate. Jews were only allowed to come into the city through a gate which literally had a sign on it, an apartheid-era sign, and only Jews and cattle, only Jews and cattle allowed to pass through this gate. So that was Berlin in the 1740s. And there in Berlin, over time, besides learning in this very high-level yeshiva of his Rebbe Frankel, he also begins teaching himself. He's an autodidact, I should say. He doesn't have formal secular education, and he is a genius. There's no doubt about that. He's a genius. He teaches himself maths. He finds himself a tutor, a Polish Jewish refugee to teach him maths. He teaches himself Latin. He learns German. He didn't actually speak German. He spoke a version of Yiddish, a Western European version of Yiddish known as Judeo-Deutsch, Judedeutsch, a type of Jewish dialect. He earns little money as a poor student and uses his money to buy philosophy books. He buys John Locke's book, which has a big impact on him, and he teaches himself French and then English. And he eventually becomes appointed as a tutor by a wealthy Jewish merchant, and eventually rises. He earns the confidence of this Jewish merchant and becomes his bookkeeper, his accountant, and eventually a partner in the business. And this is what sustains him. He's a textile merchant. He's in the schmatter trade. That's how he finances himself, and rises to become a public intellectual par excellence. I will say at this point, because we're now going to go through his rise to prominence in the non-Jewish world, we're talking about a figure who is prominent in the non-Jewish world also. So this isn't just a figure of bespoke niche Jewish interest. He's someone who is recognized in Germany at the time as an outstanding philosopher. Does he really make any long-term contributions to broader philosophy? No. But at the time, he's seen as an outstanding philosopher. See, in any field of human endeavor, there's only a few figures who become Newtons and Einsteins, and he isn't one of those. He's not someone whose work is sort of significantly studied anymore. But behind the figures that make international level acclaim are tens of people who are phenomenal individuals who at the time are very, very famous, who make important stepping contributions to the development of philosophy. And he's one such person. He's not just a Jewish philosopher that we're interested in. He's someone who makes absolute contribution to the development of Western philosophy, and is a really important figure in that sense of the word. But he's not someone that, at the end of the day, made sort of breakthroughs that are going to be studied for all time and for all eternity. But he's a very, very important figure in Germany at the time, and widely recognized as such. The German Jewish community is outstandingly proud of him, and German society in general is outstandingly proud of him. Coins are minted in his honor and that sort of thing. He's a public intellectual of the first order, absolutely.
I guess I'll ask you,
Yes.
what's the evidence actually had smicha. There seems to be a debate.
Okay, the question is being asked about whether he had smicha or not. He did, as far as we know, he did not have smicha. He went to Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz to apply for smicha and didn't achieve it. So, and this is why I said, I don't think anyone can claim, again, he was a top tier Talmud Chacham. He wasn't. Was he a competent learner? As far as we can tell, yes. No reason to think otherwise. His work demonstrates enormous scholarship, and he's a controversial figure. But basically, no one manages no one questions the basic level of his scholarship. He's definitely a scholar. It's not necessarily a terrible failure to refuse to get smicha, to not achieve smicha from Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz is the Rosh Hashiva of the generation, and this is a man, a boy, who at the end of the day hasn't put in enough time into yeshiva learning. He learns in yeshiva for a few years, but it's what we would call yeshiva katana. It's a young yeshiva, it's from 14 to 17, and then he begins devoting considerable time and energy to other things. So the fact that he even had a havamina, even a thought of being able to achieve smicha is remarkable. And Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz is the Rosh Hashiva of the generation. At some point or other, we'll talk about the Eibeshitz Emden controversy. But whatever Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz's views were on other things, he was the Rosh Hashiva of the preeminent posek of his time, and we know for a fact he did not achieve smicha from Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. Is it possible he got smicha elsewhere from some lesser figure? Possible, but as far as I know, we don't really have any evidence of such a claim. Yeah, his claim to fame is not as a rabbinic scholar. There's no, not as a classic rabbinic scholar, anyway. Now, sometime around the mid-1750s, Moses Mendelssohn has his great break, and he is introduced to a non-Jewish German philosopher called Gotthold Lessing, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, not a Jewish man, a Christian, German scholar and philosopher, who is wowed by this young Jewish genius, and they become enormous friends, and Lessing promotes the fame of Mendelssohn. He introduces Mendelssohn to all the movers and shakers. He gets Mendelssohn sponsorship for his works. He introduces him to the great literary salons, which is where sort of talking takes place. He defends him from controversy. Mendelssohn, whatever else he suffers from, does not suffer from underconfidence, and takes on some big German names, perhaps foolishly and unwisely so. And he is lucky to have this great patron in the figure of Lessing. And Lessing, again, who no one has heard of nowadays and is nowhere near as famous a figure as Mendelssohn, is a very, very important patron for Mendelssohn. He writes books and plays and stories about this young Jewish genius, in which he sort of pseudonymously calls him Nathan the Wise, and he has these works and books, which I don't think anyone reads nowadays either, unless you're sort of a niche historian of Mendelssohn, in which he talks about this Jewish genius, and everyone recognizes he's describing Mendelssohn's. Basically, Lessing is a very brief biography. He's a generation older than Mendelssohn. He's sort of 30 years older than Mendelssohn. He's again German. He's born to a pastor, born to a religious German family, and studies and becomes a philosopher. He becomes a librarian to the Royal Library, the Ducal Library, and writes various philosophical works and plays and stories and so on, all of which are of no major interest to at least to me or to anyone, I think, really, other than that he becomes central to Mendelssohn's life and promotes him and introduces him to the broader non-Jewish world.
It's interesting, there's a statue of him outside the Jewish Museum.
Yes.
Vienna. Statue for Lessing, but nothing for Mendelssohn.
So Lessing deserves statues because he is broad-minded enough in a world that can't conceive of the idea that a Jew can contribute to Western culture. He's big enough to recognize that, and he sets out his life's mission to promote this young Jewish genius and get him recognized across Germany. In his play, by the way, before he met Mendelssohn, or maybe around the time he met Mendelssohn, he writes a drama called Die Juden, the Jews. And basically the message of the story is that Jews can have, very controversial idea, that Jews can have nobility of culture and nobility of character. And he's ridiculed for the play. Like it's this ridiculous idea. So I don't think we can imagine the degree to which we're living in a profoundly racist world. And maybe that's one reason why he's so delighted to meet Mendelssohn, because he, exhibits in his evidence that actually Jews can achieve culture. By the way, most Jews have a tremendous disadvantage in integrating into German culture. Their German is almost always their second language. They've grown up speaking Judedeutsch, this Yiddish, Western European Yiddish. And therefore, their German is always written German is always clumsy. They always speak with an accent, and therefore it's very hard if you live in a sort of a racist world. It's very hard to take seriously. I suppose a modern English equivalent would be if someone turns up with a very, I don't know, Geordie accent, and I don't know if Geordies do this, or an East End accent with double negatives and the like, and claim to be a serious intellectual. The liberal Hampstead elite, despite their claims of tolerance, would mock and sneer and find it very hard to take seriously. And this is the sort of world that Jews find themselves in. Mendelssohn doesn't have these problems. He becomes famous for speaking a beautiful German and writing exceptional German. Again, it's very hard for us English people, I think, to relate to this, but for whatever reason, in Germany at the time, this is seen as a very significant degree of culture. I think now most people would expect a decent English to be a prerequisite to literary sensibility and seriousness. But I don't think, just writing a good English lends you credence as a philosopher. But in Germany at the time, it's the time of the beginning of the emergence of some level of German nationalism and pride in German language and the ability of German to be used to convey intellectual ideas. Europe's gone through a transition in which Latin was the language that was used for all intellectual pursuit. On some level, French has risen as the new literary and intellectual language. English is rising as the new language of science, and Germany wants its place in the family of respectable European languages. With all due respect to Danish or to Flemish or to Polish, these aren't international languages used for intellectual discourse, and Germany is one of those, even to this day to some degree, and it wants to be one of those. So Mendelssohn's ability to write in a beautiful Germany and convey German and convey profound ideas is very significant in the development of German culture. And Lessing and Mendelssohn remain allies for decades. Um, Mendelssohn writes various essays, and Lessing publishes them without Mendelssohn's permission in order to promote Mendelssohn. And basically, Mendelssohn begins mixing in literary and intellectual circles. He's quite brave. He's critical of some of the poems that were written at the time, and the like. He rises to the peaks of philosophical fame in 1762, perhaps a year later, 1763. He wins a prize offered by the Berlin Academy for using mathematics for metaphysical ideas. So this is something that we've spoken a bit about in our previous series. But some of the maths and metaphysics have an overlap, and he writes an essay on the subject that wins the prize. I will simply demonstrate his achievement by mentioning that the second winner, the runner-up in this prize, is a little-known figure known as Immanuel Kant. So we're talking about a serious philosopher over here. Now, of course, in the long run, Immanuel Kant contributes much more to philosophy. To this day, everyone obsesses around his writings. As I said, people do not obsess around Mendelssohn's writings, but he's someone who is a serious philosopher. Now, around the same time, Mendelssohn is forced into beginning to think and write more deeply about Jewish identity. So, had this not happened, perhaps Mendelssohn could have remained a Jewish philosopher, in the sense of a Jew who is a philosopher, and he would have remained a frum Jew. He was a practicing frum Jew his whole life, and he would have written about general philosophy, and I suppose he would have been of interest to philosophers and of interest to Jews. It's a nice thing that you have a frum Jew who's a seminal philosopher and very well respected, but he is forced into writing and defending his Jewish identity. And basically, in April 1763, a young theology student from Zurich comes and visits Mendelssohn. And he basically says to Mendelssohn, you're a reasonable man, you're an intelligent man, you're an honest intellectual, and you should be honest. Now, clearly and obviously, that means that you should accept Christianity because you are a member of this primitive, backward faith with parochial values and this weird ritual. And surely now it is time to take the next step and formally convert to Christianity. And this is a profoundly reflective, profoundly German Christian flavor of anti-Semitism, in which it is obvious that Judaism is the more primitive version. This is sort of replacement theology, and the New Testament upgrades Judaism, and Judaism was okay as stage one. God's revelations is very primitive folk, but how can anyone serious take Judaism seriously? And he basically says to Mendelssohn, you need to do the honorable thing if you have any claim to being a respectable philosopher and recognize the philosophical truths of Christianity and convert. And here, I'll come to in a moment, Avram, here Mendelssohn takes the first of his important decisions, and I would say the first major controversy he gets caught up in life, a controversy that causes him enormous stress. Sorry.
It's German times and Judaism and conversions that took place amongst Jews. Because my understanding is at the time there was quite a movement in that, and I don't know that much.
So Avram is asking, can I put this in context of general German assimilation and German conversion to Christianity and the like? And the answer is it's not yet a mass phenomena. It's a very unspoken of part of German Jewish history. The dropout rate of assimilation and Jews leaving orthodoxy is well known and well discussed in Hirsch's later controversies with the early founders of Reform. What is less well known is that there is mass conversion amongst German Jews later, not yet. This is the beginning of German Jewry having aspirations to achieve more. In a way, by the ghetto gates partially coming down, Jews are exposed to life outside the ghetto, and suddenly it becomes tempting. And it's very frustrating when your career is held up and you can't get positions of prominence without converting to Christianity. And sadly and tragically, horribly high rates of Jews convert to Christianity. It's almost been wiped out from collective Jewish memory. Later on, we're talking about really a century after Mendelssohn. Perhaps 50% of German Jews end up converting to Christianity. The founders of Reform see themselves as anti-assimilationist. What do you mean? We are offering a version of Judaism that can allow a Jew to hold their head high and remain Jewish and still fit into. So they see themselves as fighting assimilation. That's how far the narratives differ. And on some small level, Mendelssohn gets caught up in this because Mendelssohn, part of his work, as we're going to see shortly, we're not up to his major Jewish work, is making Judaism align to some degree with Western values. And his supporters say he's creating a type of modern orthodoxy, you could call it, an orthodoxy that can exist in the modern world. And his critics will say it's assimilationist. And Mendelssohn would say, what are you talking about? I'm offering a Judaism that a respectable intellectual Jew can relate to and continue to connect to. So we're not yet at the time of mass conversion. It's a trickle at this stage. And Mendelssohn, this theology student, Lavater, says to Mendelssohn, go and do it. And of course, if Mendelssohn does it, this is going to create a tidal wave and a terrible impact and so on. More than that, Mendelssohn is a very intellectually honest person. And this is one example of how so often Mendelssohn ends up upsetting everyone. Mendelssohn, in his correspondence with Lavater, which is later publicized, so Lavater creates open communication out of things that quite possibly Mendelssohn wanted to say privately. Mendelssohn is a very nuanced thinker. When Lavater asks him what he thinks about the founder of Christianity, he doesn't give the classic Jewish response of, terrible, absolutely awful, horrible human being. He says, actually, there's moral messages that JC gives that are beautiful, and I can sort of see the value in them, and I see why Christians were very moved by them. There are aspects of the founder of Christianity's teachings which do to some degree echo the prophets who scream at the Jewish people and say, you're so caught up in the ritual and Lomeli Rosef Chechem and what's about Tzedek and Mishpat and so on. And this is part of the founder of Christianity's message. And he says, I can see the beauty of that. I can see the spiritually appealing message to that. And in truth, we don't know that much about the historical founder of Christianity. It says Mendelssohn, as long as he kept ritual law, and as long as he didn't declare himself God or the Son of God in some crazy form, and we don't know what the founder of Christianity, which claims he made for himself and which claims his student made, then no problem with him. I can respect him as a person. Now, you can kind of get what he's doing over here, which is he's saying to this young perhaps sweet, perhaps naive, perhaps innocent, perhaps disingenuous, Machiavellian. We don't know, theologians, Like, I'm not an enemy of Christianity. I'm not out to attack it, and I get why it offers a nice spiritual message. And I don't really either have any major issue with the historical founds of Christianity, who we don't know much about. If he kept halacha and didn't say anything that was pagan in his sort of identity with God, I can relate to a lot of his mussar and his moral messaging and so on. So basically, Lavater tries to convert Mendelssohn, and Mendelssohn resists, and they begin exchanging open letters. Lavater writes him an open letter, and he sends him tracts in which basically he argues. He says, if you love truth, if you love wisdom, if you love honesty, if you claim to be a Socrates-like figure who is willing to pay any price for the sake of honesty, you should convert to Christianity. And Mendelssohn gets drawn into this open communication and response, in which he has to be a little bit careful still about what he says. We're not living in a world of free discourse, so he has to be a little bit careful in how he phrases things, but to some degree probably reflecting his truthful opinion. And he says you can respect a figure without thinking you have to sort of take on the whole movement. He says, I've read Confucius, and I think the Chinese philosopher, and I think there's really interesting things in what he writes, and I think there's really interesting moral and philosophical ideas there. It doesn't mean I'm going to convert to Confucianism. Just because I think somebody's an interesting figure with interesting and important spiritual moral messages to say, doesn't mean I'm going to buy hook, line, and buy completely into their religion. I'm going to go become a Confucian thinker. This is ridiculous. And I think there's some things that the founder of Christianity says that are interesting and moral and spiritual. I get why you find him moving, and I've got no axe to grind, but I'm not going to become Christian. This is ridiculous. And basically, again and again, Lavater writes in public that Mendelssohn is this great person. He's this brilliant soul with piercing eyes, an ugly body. He was this hunchback with this sort of curvature of the spine. And I wish that Mendelssohn stopped only talking about Plato and Moses, and also accepted the third great spiritual figure not the third greatest, the third great spiritual figure that you need in the trinity of great thinkers, Plato, Moses, and of course the founder of Christianity. And Moses Mendelssohn refuses to do so. What's really interesting is that all Mendelssohn's Jewish works are now written in these last decades of his life, when he is suffering from enormous stress. I suppose in modern terms, it's a bit like on social media, a young student with idealism and passion and too much time on their hands can write endlessly against a senior figure, Mendelssohn, using social media. He's writing these open letters, and Mendelssohn has to respond. And it's just driven crazy, but he just doesn't have the time and energy to respond. He wants to do other things, and this causes him enormous attack, which some people think was due to stress. Others think he had heart problems. We don't really know. And eventually, he dies in 1786 of this cold or this pneumonia. Now, basically, it was during this last decades of his life, while he's suffering from poor health, that Mendelssohn realizes he needs to start doing two things. He needs to start writing to Jews about Judaism, and he needs to start writing to non-Jews, to Gentiles, about Judaism. How can it be that a well-meaning student of philosophy and theology, Lavater, is so convinced that Judaism is primitive that he can be shocked that an honest intellectual like Mendelssohn doesn't accept the truths of Christianity, and therefore he has to start writing more about Judaism. Now, the problem Mendelssohn faced is that in some respects, Judaism isn't a Western faith, it is Yiddishkeit. And in his process of marketing Judaism to non-Jews and marketing Judaism to Jews, he wishes to here we get to controversial words, rewrite or present or emphasize aspects of Judaism that he thinks are important and that are palatable to the Western ear. Now, I've mentioned again and again that all representations of Judaism are old, new, old. No one who is taken seriously as a Jewish thinker is an innovator in the sense of coming out of nowhere. Everyone is coming from Tanakh, from Gemara, from Midrashim, from Chazal. The question is what are you laying emphasis on? And in that sense, Mendelssohn is part of a great tradition of figures who do that. To some degree or other, the Rambam is taking Judaism and taking the philosophy of his time, this Aristotelian Platonic philosophy, and is emphasizing aspects of Chazal to demonstrate how Torah fits in to this particular philosophy. In some ways, the Baal Shem Tov is doing this with his revolution. Everything he's doing is grounded in Chazal, but he's emphasizing, as we discussed in our previous series on Hasidus, certain aspects of Judaism. Mendelssohn is doing the same. And Mendelssohn would probably argue, not probably, certainly argue, what I'm doing is presenting authentic Judaism. Look, everything I'm saying is backed up by classic sources, by Chazals, and yes, I'm aware that I'm presenting a certain angle on things, but this is 100% faithful to the tradition. It's my genuine philosophical understanding of Yiddishkeit. And in so doing, I'm creating Yiddishkeit that is fit for the spiritual zeitgeist, the philosophical needs of the time. And Judaism always has to be able to speak to the philosophical mindset of the time. And his opponents would say, no, you're reworking and rewriting Judaism into the image of it becoming a sort of Western faith and westernizing it and the like. So what does Mendelssohn do? All we're going to do today is an overview. We'll look in more detail at his philosophy in future weeks. But basically, he embarks on a series of writings that his opponents accuse him of censoring Judaism, sanitizing Judaism, presenting a Judaism with only one aspect that sort of fits into Mendelssohn's particular Berlin mindset of the 1760s. And his supporters say, no, this is, again, he's not that far off in time, the Baal Shem Tov. He's not that far off the time others who emphasize different aspects of Judaism. A generation later than him, Rabbi Zobin is going to do the same thing with his ethics revolution. Raphael Hirsch is going to do the same thing with his neo-orthodoxy. So in an alternative history, had Mendelssohn won the conversation, which he didn't, because I think the consensus is that, to some degree, that what he did wasn't a 100% accurate presentation of Judaism, but he's trying to create a Yiddishkeit driven by spiritual goals. He believes this is necessary for the flourishing of Jews in the Western world. He's trying to create a Judaism that speaks to what he believes are the spiritual needs of the time. And in some shape or form, he does succeed in creating a new movement of Yiddishkeit, because he is the father or the grandfather of Haskala and reforms. So we'll have to discuss in future weeks to what degree he really is the key influence on both these movements, but he definitely is seen as having an impact on those. So what does he do? Well, he embarks on a brilliant project, his so-called Biur, which is a translation and commentary on the Torah. Not dissimilar, you might argue, with ArtScroll. It's written in English, in German. It's got a little commentary. He selects Mefarshim and the like, and you would think this is a fairly non-controversial project to embark on. It's an outstanding work. Whether you criticize it or agree with it, it's a phenomenal work. The quality of the German translation is remarkable. The philological research and the linguistic research and the historical research and the range of Mefarshim that he quotes and his mastery of Jewish grammar, it's a phenomenal work, which sends waves through Europe. Its precision, its elegance of language, his array of classic commentaries, by the way, he's not quoting dodgy commentaries. He's selecting and choosing Midrashim and Chazals and Mefarshim and adding some of his own Chidushim and his own insights. It's an amazing work, and it's a work that gets quoted by later figures who are writing their own commentaries on Torah, famous figures like the Malbim and so on. It's an amazing work. However, it's not written in Lashon HaKodesh. But you might say, well, okay, I mean, we know of great works that are written in English. We have the Hertz, we have the ArtScrolls. Who cares? Well, the answer is, it depends which environment you are writing to. In a world in which a very small part of the population actually speak High German, and Jews are speaking, well, in Ashkenazi world are speaking Yiddish or Judeo-Deutsch, Western Yiddish or Eastern Yiddish, what is really the goal of your work? Why are you writing this work in high, literary, beautiful German? Which target audience are you aiming at? And which Mefarshim and Chazals are you picking and choosing? Now, everyone has to pick and choose. Rashi picks and chooses Chazals. But is there a hidden agenda here in picking explanations of the Psukim which sanitize them and westernize them and even somewhat Christianize them, make them compatible and comfortable to the Western ear? Is this great work of the Biur actually a work that's trying to introduce Jews to High German? Now, as a matter of historical fact, we know that it does do that to some degree. So yeshiva bochrim, who are interested in escaping the confines of the yeshivas, classic, Jews living in little German villages and with no access to education, well, they get hold of the Biur, and you can reverse engineer the Biur and use it to teach yourself quality German. Is that Mendelssohn's agenda? Well, you could argue yes, because why are you writing a book in High German when there's a tiny percentage of the German Jewish population who are actually speaking this language? Or you could say he's a visionary. He sees the tidal wave of the future, and he says we need to start writing books in beautiful German so that it's accessible to a German-speaking Jewish audience. Otherwise, what forum are they going to learn? And he's mixing in an environment in Berlin, in which there is already developing a very small cluster of such Jews, and they have no access to classic Mefarshim and so on. They're not like Mendelssohn, who have had at least a few years in yeshiva and have access to these things. So I'm writing a great work that's necessary for the survival of the Jews. So is he a great visionary, the father of writing in the native tongue and spreading Torah through that way? Or is this part of his reformist agenda? Again, a generation later, a figure like Hirsch writes in beautiful literary German, and no one objects to him, because now you're dealing with a world where that is what everyone is speaking, and of course you need to write that. Several generations later, Article writes in English, accessible English, and again, no one objects to the concept, because of course you're writing to a world in which people need the Torah to be written in an accessible language. But what is his real aim over here? Is it a way of helping Jews integrate into Western culture, or is it a visionary work written by a Talmid Chacham and a tzaddik who wants to help Jews who are, whether we like it or not, integrating into the modern world, and therefore needs access to Torah materials? Mendelssohn also becomes significantly involved in furthering Jewish rights. He persuades some of his Christian, German, non-Jewish philosophers to write works about mitigating and easing the situation of the Jews. He himself writes a book which is basically a plea for freedom of conscience, for freedom of worship. A wonderful book. He basically says, my German brothers and sisters, it actually says brothers, we're not living in a world where you write to sisters. He says, my German brothers, if you really care for values, if you believe in Christianity and the power of ideas, of correct ideas to triumph, if you really believe in a genuine relationship to God, then you should be promoting freedom of worship and freedom of conscience. Now, in arguing to do this, he gets himself caught up in his next controversy, because he basically argues from classic Jewish sources that Judaism believes in freedom of conscience, and that to be a true spiritual practitioner, you need to freely choose to recognize God and to engage in religious faith. And that is the deepest form of religious conviction. That's where true sincerity and spirituality is found, and that's a Jewish heritage, that's a Christian heritage, and therefore Germany should introduce freedom of faith. Is that true? Is that true? Does Judaism believe in freedom of conscience and the like? Well, in the 21st century, we all do, by the less brave, with no choice. But we're writing in a world in which, well, first of all, classic sources have plenty of forcing people to keep halacha. There's whole systems of punishment for people that don't keep halacha. When we talk about capital punishment in the Torah, I gave us a share recently. So we always use the example of murder for capital punishment because it's a relatively uncontroversial. But Judaism has Chil Shabbos being with capital punishment. Judaism has Makkos. It has extensive authority to force people to keep halacha. Is this an accurate portrayal of Judaism? And you could argue, yes, you could say in essence, all religiosity is meaningless unless it's coming from choice. But if you're building a Jewish society, you need compulsion just for the function of society. But in truth, as per Mendelssohn, we really believe in freedom of conscience. Or maybe not. Maybe it's Mendelssohn sanitizing Judaism and sanitizing Christianity for that matter, and trying to argue for a certain version and flavor of spirituality so that Jews can flourish in the Western world. We are all beneficiaries of this argument, right? We live in a liberal world. Has that been good for society or not? Has Jews, like Mendelssohn, caused a genuine loss of spirituality? Is he one of the figures that have sort of taken even Christianity away from its roots? Maybe society does need a degree of compulsion in religious consciousness and conscience for it to flourish. And Mendelssohn argues against that. He argues that classic Jewish sources don't. Now, more than that, he isn't just arguing about classic Jewish thought. He's living in a world in which there's still considerable rabbinic authority. He's living really in the last generation in Western Europe of where the Kehillah functions on the fullest level. If you are the chief rabbi of a traditional Jewish community, you still have considerable power over your community. The shamash goes round, waking everyone up for Shacharis, and if you don't turn up, there's a question about that. If you do something against against halacha or cultural norms, it's still in a world in which you can be put in stocks in the courtyard of the community. You're there in stocks. Everyone who walks past spits at you, gives you a little kick, throws a rotten tomato at you. That's still the world within which people are living. We're still living in a world in which people can be given makas by the Kehillah. They can still be given lashes. The cherem is still a tool that's being used at the time. The contemporary of Mendelssohn, the Vilna Gaon, and many, many others are still running Kehillas. The Vilna Gaon never became a rabbinic head and a communal leader in that sense, but we have stories in which the Vilna Gaon asks for the communal leaders to put people in stocks and the like. This is still a world in which the Kehillah has the right. So in arguing for Jewish emancipation, he's arguing that philosophically, Judaism and Christianity doesn't believe in compulsion in religion, a controversial claim, and he's arguing that it shouldn't be practiced, and thus taking on the Kehillah structure that still dominates Ashkenaz, the Western Europe, and Eastern European Jewry. He's arguing that Jews shouldn't be able to compel. Religion should come from a spiritual need, from a search for truth, from a search for peace. Now, Kant thinks this is amazing. Immanuel Kant, beaten, as we said in the maths essay, by his contemporary Mendelssohn, thinks this is wonderful. Mendelssohn thinks that he is strengthening Judaism by so doing, and many Jews don't think that he is doing so correctly. As a matter of history, for example, as I mentioned, he is attacked. His vision of Judaism is attacked. He sees this. He says, "I have confidence that most rabbonim, most elders will be very happy with what I'm writing." And he's basically advocating for separation of church and state. And the leading posek at the time, Rabbi Haskala, the author of the Note of Yehuda, famous name, comes out attacking Ramosha Dessau, attacking Mendelssohn, and he says this is outrageous. This is the destruction of Judaism. And he also says that you have engaged in treason, because here we are fighting for Jewish autonomy and for the power of the Jewish community, and you write in German as a German writer, writing to the broader German population and government, saying for this picture of emancipation and calling for the closure of the Kehillah authority, for the power of the rabbinate and the Kehillah authorities to promote and force practice of Judaism. Why are you writing in German? If you want to generate an internal Jewish discussion, fine, write amongst Jews and say that we've got religion a bit wrong, but why are you writing in German? Now, Mendelssohn's answer is, I'm writing in German because I want to influence German government policy and I'm calling for emancipation. Landau, Rabbi Cheskel Landau, the Note of Yehuda says, you're writing in German and you're calling upon them to remove our classic rights as Jews to run our own affairs. You're basically a traitor. And also, you're being somewhat naive, because we know what's going to happen. All that will happen is we'll be stripped of our autonomy, but we won't get the rights in return. And to some degree, the great Note of Yehuda, Haskala Landau, he doesn't need my approval, was right. Not only on a spiritual level does the fall of the ghettos lead to a massive wave of assimilation, on a political level, the loss of autonomy of Kehillah weakened Jewish rabbinic structure. Now, again, we can argue whether this happens anyway. What were Mendelssohn's real motives in all of this? But certainly, as far as we can tell, Mendelssohn is interested in promoting Jewish strength, and he sees this as the way to do this. So Moses Mendelssohn, finds himself under attack from the most prominent posek hador, Rav Cheskel Landau. He also gets caught up in another battle, a halachic battle. Now, one of the obsessions of the 1760s and 1770s was the issue of burial, and the fear that many people had that in being buried, they would be buried alive. Medicine wasn't that good as telling when people were dead and when this was a coma or when this was unconscious. And proposals were put forward to delay burial for a week or for 3 days until people would be deemed to be certainly death, as a way to avoid catastrophes of being buried alive. By the way, records show that this did sometimes occur. as gory as this is, with graves have been dug up where there are claw marks and scratch marks on the coffin. Aristocrats used to pay for elaborate burial rites where there was a rope buried in the grave where they could pull the rope and that could cause a bell to sound.
Saved by the bell.
Yeah, saved by the bell. The other origins also suggestive this, but one of the origins. Here actually near Bournemouth, there's I went to visit with my family once when we were there in Bournemouth. You can see such a construction, very, very interesting. Okay. Now, the law is being debated as to whether to introduce such a rule, and the Duke of Mecklenburg decrees that dead people should be kept under watch for 3 days, and Jews have a serious problem with this. This is nivel hameis. This is against classic halacha. We have halachic ways of determining halachic death, and we don't want to have to delay burying our dead. And Moses Mendelssohn, again, in a classic Moses Mendelssohn form, has a very nuanced response and upsets everyone in so doing. He writes a letter to the Duke of Mecklenburg arguing that Jews shouldn't have to abide by this requirement. Basically, again, freedom of conscience. I understand that you wish to make this a society, but if there's a group of people who don't care about that, they want to be buried straight away, and they say we're willing to risk being buried alive for that, and that's what members of the Orthodox community want. It's not your role as government to interfere. So again, this is separation of church and state. Let Jews bury their dead in their own way. And then he writes to the Jewish community, arguing based on halachic sources that the absence of respiration, which is the classic way of telling death, you put a feather in front of the mouth and you see if someone has stopped breathing, is not an accurate method of determining death. By the way, this has become very controversial again in the 21st century with debates around brain death and heart death, cardiac death and respiratory death and the like. Either way, Mendelssohn gets himself caught up in this debate. And basically, again, one of the most prominent rabbinical authorities of the time, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, comes out against Mendelssohn with a very fair point. It's not for me, again, to agree or disagree with Gedolim, but there's no doubt this is a fair point. And he says, who are you? You're not a posek. Like, why are you writing halachic discourse to? Whatever your qualities are, Mendelssohn has some degree of learning. He's an outstanding philosopher, grammarian. He writes really scholarly works. But you're basically, you're a yeshiva guy. You've had to, you're a few years in yeshiva, and we've got no evidence that you're particularly engaged in Talmudic learning and halachic thing. You're not a posek. You're not halachis. Why are you writing a halachic communication to the Jewish community? Keep clear, keep out of areas that you know really relatively little about. And again, this ends up as enormously controversial. Okay, we've run out of time for today, so we'll stop. There's much more to talk about, obviously, Mendelssohn's life, and then we need to look at his impact on the on Haskala and so on. But for now, we'll simply conclude by saying that Mendelssohn is a genius, a remarkable figure. He's known as the Socrates of Berlin, or the Plato of Berlin. This is a name given to him by non-Jewish contemporaries. A genius who again and again gets himself caught in controversy within the Jewish and non-Jewish world, has to expend enormous stress and energy on that. In some cases made clearly a mistake. I don't think there's any way of denying the fact that he shouldn't have got caught up in the burial controversy. From a halachic point of view, he should have stuck with his first approach to the Duke of Mecklenburg and not the second one. He's not a posek, he's not a halachist. Keep out of an area that you don't know much about. And we will see next week that even in his response to Christianity and in explaining why he isn't going to become a Christian, and he sanitizes Judaism in a way to make it palatable to the Christian ear, in a way that remains to this day exceptionally controversial. We'll stop here for today. Yes. Where are we on the argument of freedom of conscience? Own subject, own topic. Very, very difficult one. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Yes. There are Gedolim that take his side. Yeah, not necessarily on this halachic matter, but in general in his approach. He isn't someone who all Gedolim at the time were dismissive of. He's too big a figure for that to happen, and we'll see even in future generations, down to the 20th and 21st century, figures like Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky and so on. He's not a black and white figure. He's a difficult figure to understand, and certainly I think the weight of consensus is that overall he wasn't that successful, and the direct result of what he did wasn't overall positive in launching Haskala and reform. But that doesn't mean that we can say anything about his motives, and doesn't mean that in some levels he wasn't an important contributor. Sorry, Avram, yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes, yeah. Mendelssohn says very similar to that about multiple paths to God and so on. We'll come to that next week. And this is really controversial, and again, it doesn't overstep the line of kafira, but goes very close to it. And we'll talk about that. Yeah, 100%, 100%. Yeah.